What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So I thought that in this video I would continue with my list of top 10 point guards. So at number 5, I have John Stockton. All right. I would have John a little higher than this, but he doesn't have some other accolades that some of the other guys higher on this list have. Primarily championships, MVPs. He doesn't have quite the same individual dominance on the scoring tip that the other guys do. However, surprisingly, he was a much better scorer than people gave him credit for. A much better scorer. John Stockton, of course. John Stockton is probably the best pass-first point guard in the history of basketball. Remarkable career if you watch this guy. And it really irks the shit out of me when I see a lot of young people say shit like, well, John Stockton wouldn't make it into today's league. How on earth do you feel that a guy that, look, a guy that shot 51.5% in his era, 38% from three, and was playing in an era where it was more the rule rather than exception of point guards being more pass first. You know, him and Mark Jackson and others. I guess Rod Strickland being there as well, right? More pass first than scores. And now you put him in an era where he'd be favored and pushed to shoot more. A guy that's already a great shooter. I don't get it. It's whatever. Plus, he has a high basketball IQ, which is something that you don't see as much of in today's NBA. A tremendous passer. I don't know. Whatever. But anyway, John Stockton is the all-time leader in assists. It's not close, and I don't see anybody anytime soon approaching that record. He's the all-time leader in steals, and I don't really see anybody coming close to that. Maybe LeBron James if he plays long enough. Maybe. But those two records right now are solidly secure. John Stockton is a top 50 all-time player, and he was an inaugural member of Professional Men's Olympics on that 92 Dream Team, a team that is still heavily touted today. Some people still feel like it's the greatest collection of talent in the history of basketball. But you know, John Stockton was not that heavily touted coming into the league. When he played college ball in Gonzaga, nobody really was looking at him like that. When you look at the 84 draft, and that was a tremendous draft with Olajuwon going first, and then Jordan at third, and Barkley at fifth, or wherever the hell he was at, fourth or fifth. John Stockton was 16th. Not exactly the highest guy on the totem pole. And while guys like Olajuwon and Jordan instantly got heavy minutes going to their respective teams, Charles Barkley was not really starting at first, but a lot of that was because of the fact that he was on a team with Hall of Famers like Julius Erving and Moses Malone. Would be Hall of Famers if it wasn't for injuries like guys like Andrew Toney. When you look at that, but John Stockton, he was starting behind a guy named Ricky Green. So it wasn't like he was starting behind or he was coming off the bench behind a Hall of Fame team, or Hall of Famers. Ricky Green was a decent, pretty good point guard, but not great. But eventually, after 2 or 3 seasons, as the Utah Jazz moved away from the era of Adrian Dantley after he was traded to the Detroit Pistons, And Frank Layden began to see that John Stockton and Karl Malone were a very brutal duo. Eventually, and John Stockton was a superior point guard. Eventually, by the 87-88 season, John Stockton was starting for the Utah Jazz. And this would begin a tremendous era for the Utah Jazz. The duo of Stockton and Malone came on like gangbusters. In their first year together, they pushed the Lakers to 7 games, and I think that was the semis. Someone can refresh my memory what round it is. I sometimes forget rounds of playoffs as years go by, but I know they pushed them to a 7. I think it was the semis. Someone can correct me in the comment section if I'm wrong. But John Stockton and Karl Malone were the most formidable duo in the NBA. They were 2 of the toughest players in the NBA. You can ask Isaiah Thomas about that. John Stockton was old school. He still wore the short shorts in the 90s and into the 2000s, a style that had gone out of style by the mid-80s to late 80s, but John Stockton continued to wear the short shorts. He had a reputation for being a little bit dirty, defensively. John Stockton was a tenacious player, a fierce competitor who genuinely hid his emotions. You couldn't tell by his face, which was a poker face, how he really felt out there. One thing I do remember about watching John Stockton is when he was pissed off, his jaw would get kind of clamp. You know what I'm saying? Like whenever I used to look at John Stockton and as a teenager, right, or as a preteen, and I would watch the Utah Jazz play, and if they were down by like 20 points at halftime, and if I saw that John Stockton's jaw was tight, I said, oh, shit. And he'd come out there and, him and Malone would kill in the third quarter, and Malone might score 20 in the quarter. Stockton might get 10 assists that quarter. He's shutting down his man. But, John Stockton went a stretch from the 87-88 season to the 95-96 season where he led the league in assists each year. One of those seasons, it was either the 89-90 or 90-91 season. He averaged 14.5, I want to say 89-90. He averaged 14.5 assists per game, which is the all-time record. As a matter of fact, I think the next season he still averaged over 14 assists per game. There were only 3 players in the history of the NBA to have seasons where they've even accumulated 1,000 assists in a season. One of them is Kevin Porter, another underrated point guard, probably a top 25 or so point guard in his own right, somewhere in that range. And also Isaiah Thomas, I think 84-85, he had 1,123 assists. That number stayed stuck in my head for some reason. John Stockton did it 7 times. 7 out of the 9 seasons he led the league in assists, he accumulated over 1,000 career assists. 1,000 assists in the season. One thing I also remember about John Stockton is that he was a very capable scorer, but he genuinely stayed to the script of being a pass-first point guard. His career high was only 34 points. So he was not a guy that was prone to shooting a ball a lot, but he was incredibly efficient. For his career, he shot 51.5% from the floor. And we're talking about the 80s and 90s. We're not talking about today now, where even now you don't see guys shooting that percentage. He shot 51.5% from the floor. In the 95-96 season, he and Anthony Hardaway were the only 2 guards, and I mean shooting guards and point guards, to shoot 50% from the floor for the season. In 92-93, John Stockton was amongst the leaders in field goal percentage, shooting over 55% from the floor. So why was he able to shoot such a high percentage? Because John Stockton had a tremendously high basketball IQ, and he took smart shots. He did not wait. How can I say this? As a point guard, he was selective in what type of shots he took. He would often shoot when the ball was coming back to him. You know what I'm saying? Open at three, open at the mid-range from 20 foot. Sometimes, occasionally, John Stockton would drive to the basket, go for a layup or whatever. But he genuinely tried to shoot the basketball when he was open. He didn't force shots. I cannot really, outside of some type of force up from, with the shot clock running down, I don't really remember John Stockton forcing up too many shots. And that's why he was able to shoot at such a high clip. And despite the fact that people say, oh, John Stockton couldn't score, he couldn't score. Well, do you know that he still scored 19,711 points, which is more points than Adrian Dantley scored. That's more points than Bob McAdoo poured in. That's more points than Scottie Pippen poured in. So he was a capable scorer. He just was not a shot jacker. He routinely, John Stockton was hard pressed to take 10 shots a game, but those 10 shots he made the most out of them. He was a career 38% three-point shooter, which means that he was a better than average three-point shooter in the era where the league average was somewhere between 32 to 36% from three. For him to shoot 38%, that's better than average. He was a really good foul shooter. He shot over 80% from the foul line for his career, usually around 82, 83%. So, and you couple that with the fact that he usually was paired in the backcourt with either, what's his name, Daryl Griffith, who was a great scorer and a pretty good outside shooter in his own right. One of the first guys to utilize the three-point shot in the early 1980s. And then later on, of course, after his retirement, Griffith, later on, eventually you saw one of the great shooters in the history of the NBA, Jeff Hornishak. Let me say this about Jeff Hornishak, too. You had that clown, Kendrick Perkins, laugh and scoff about Jeff Hornishak. I think they were talking about the '98 finals and trying to basically insinuate Jeff Hornishak's a bum. Let me say this. Kendrick Perkins calling Jeff Hornishak a bum is like, it's sort of like Donald Trump calling Jeff Bezos poor. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't get it. Like, Jeff Hornishak could score. Okay? He had a season averaging over 20 points a game. He had a couple season averaging over 20 points a game. People who saw the Utah Jazz Jeff Hornishak, that version, who was getting older and injuries had, taken a toll on him. They don't remember Horny. That was his nickname, Jeff or Hornishak or Horny. They don't remember Horny when he was playing with the Suns or with the Philadelphia 76ers in the early 1990s. Okay, this is a guy that was one of the best pure shooters in the history of the league. This is a guy that usually shot 47%, 48% from the floor, maybe 49%. He shot with 40% from three, when that really was something impressive. And he shot 90% from the foul line. I remember his last year in the league, I think 99-2000, Hornishak was on pace to break the record then held by Calvin Murphy for free throw percentage until like the last week when he just went cold from the foul line. This is a guy that's one of the greatest shooters in the history of the league. And you got Kendrick Perkins, who averaged probably 3 points and 4 rebounds for his career, scoffing at Jeff Hornishak. Unfucking believable, the gall of these motherfuckers. But anyway, the Utah Jazz, if you remember watching basketball in that era, they just could never get over the hump. After the late, great Jerry Sloan took over as coach, I think the 88 season or 89, I can't remember which year it was, one of those years, 88 or 89. After he took over for Frank Layden, it might have been 88. The Utah Jazz were a formidable team. And during a 7-year stretch, they made the Western Conference Finals 5 of those 7 years. But the problem was, and if you remember anything about basketball in the late 80s into the 90s, you can make the argument that the Utah Jazz had the hardest schedule in the NBA at that time. Might be in the history of the NBA. I did a video about this many years ago. If you look at every year that they played in the playoffs from the late 80s throughout the 90s, it's like every fucking year they had a war. It was never easy for them. They didn't have a postseason where they lucked up and played an injured team, or they lucked up and played, a team that really wasn't that good. Nope. Early on, it was the Showtime Lakers, or they had to go through Portland. I'm talking about Clyde Drexler's Portland team, or they would have to go through Olajuwon Rockets, or they would have to go through Gary Payton and those Sonics teams, Dave Robinson and the Spurs. You know what I'm saying? Later on, Shaq and Kobe's Lakers, even though they did kind of manhandle that team. But it was never an easy path. It was never an easy path. Later on, they were being vanquished by, I think, Chris Webber and his that Kings team. They sometimes had to battle against that high-scoring Phoenix Suns team in the playoffs. I think they might have even played when Charles Barkley was there, and definitely prior to that when it was Tom Chambers and Kevin Johnson and Jeff Hornishak and Dan Marley and those guys. What's his name was on that team too. Johnson. Damn. I can't think of his name right now. But yeah, they never had an easy path. But finally in 1997 in the Western Conference Finals, in that Game 6, a game they were trailing like they were going to lose, John Stockton put that team on his back, and he hit that game winner to send them to the finals. That's the most emotion you ever saw from John Stockton in his career. And he led them to the NBA Finals, but they just could not get past Michael Jordan and Chicago Bulls. And they gave the Bulls a hell of a run. They really did, but they just could not get past the Chicago Bulls during that window of opportunity they had in 97 and 98. John Stockton really only had 1 year where he suffered a major injury. I think it was the 88-89 season. I think he tore his MCL. Other than that, he was remarkably healthy and durable for his career. He retired after the 2002-2003 season. And Karl Malone would play 1 more year with the Lakers, and that was it for him. But after he retired, John Stockton was, phenomenal. You know he was going to be first ballot Hall of Fame, and he went into the Hall of Fame in 2009 along with Dave Robinson and Michael Jordan. But for his career, he was a 10-time NBA All-Star. He was a 1993 All-Star Game MVP, 2-time All-NBA First Team, 6-time All-NBA Second Team, 3rd All-NBA Third Team. 5 times he was on the NBA All-Defensive Second Team. And like I said, John Stockton was, one of the better defensive players in the league. Was not fast, but he took advantage of the rules at the time, the rules where you could be more physical. He would hand check you. He would bump you. He would be really physical. And a lot of players complained about that with John Stockton. He was, like I said, he led the league in assists 9 different times, which is an all-time record. He led the NBA in steals twice, the 88-89 season and the 91-92 season. And he was on the 50th anniversary all-time team back in 1997. His number 12 retired by the Utah Jazz. And he had career averages of 13.1 points, 10.5 assists, 2.2 steals. I believe he is the only player other than Magic Johnson to average more than 10 assists per game for his career. I gotta check something though. There's one other guy that might have done it, and I gotta be careful about it. I don't think he did it, but he might have. Let me check something out here. No, he didn't do it either. I was seeing whether Kevin Johnson did. No, so yeah, they're the only two guys. Stockton averaged 10.5 assists per game for his career. Magic 11.2 for his career. So yeah, John Stockton definitely one of the great point guards in the history of this game. So tell me what you guys think.